Us now, NBC News senior White House correspondent Garrett Haake, Semaphore White House correspondent Shelby Talcott, and former Deputy National Security Advisor and MSNBC political contributor Ben Rhodes. Garrett, I want to start with you. We just saw those images of the president in the Oval. He just said, quote, "I think Putin and Zelensky will make peace." He may be the only one who thinks that at this moment, but what are we expecting from this closely watched meeting between the two leaders tomorrow, and how much is at stake for President Trump?
Yeah, Christina, as the clouds roll in here in Anchorage today, we're losing some clarity about what the goals of this particular meeting will be here between the presidents. Tomorrow, the White House has been kind of all over the map about this, at times ramping up expectations that the goal would be to strike some kind of ceasefire agreement, at other times lowering them. So press secretary suggesting earlier this week that this is really just a listening exercise to try to see how close Putin is to being willing to make a deal for peace. We seem to be settling somewhere closer into that territory with the president's comments today, saying that the goal of this meeting is to get to the next meeting, which would then also include Zelensky and perhaps some European leaders. Here he was responding to a question about that just a minute ago.
We have a meeting with President Putin tomorrow. I think it's going to be a good meeting, but the more important meeting will be the second meeting that we're having. We're going to have a meeting with President Putin, President Zelensky, myself, and maybe we'll bring some of the European leaders along, maybe not. I don't know that it's going to be very important. We're going to see what happens.
Obviously, Zelensky and the Europeans very much want a seat at the table for whatever the final end of this war might look like should we ever get there. But this probably also serves Vladimir Putin's goals of continuing the war on his own terms quite well. We'll see how much the tone around this changes between now and the time this summit starts to get underway tomorrow.
And, you know, you talk about him referencing the Europeans there. Shelby, sources I've talked to in Europe are practically apoplectic at the whole concept of this summit. Usually these summits are a reward for doing the thing, but Putin hasn't really done any of the things Trump has asked him to do. Is the summit itself already a win for Moscow? And why doesn't the president seem to think of it that way?
Yeah, we've heard that argument plenty of times from people over the past week who are really concerned that just the idea of Donald Trump meeting in person with Putin sort of legitimizes the Russian president and what is happening with Ukraine. And the White House's argument is that they believe that a face-to-face meeting could do more to getting a ceasefire deal than some of these past phone calls and some of these sort of very long, multi-formatted situations where you have a third party going to meet with Russian leaders. They say that right now is time for the two leaders to sit down together. And for whatever reason, they believe that this could bring them closer to a ceasefire deal. But as Garrett said, they're also tempering expectations. There is an acknowledgement, both publicly and privately, that, you know, Putin still hasn't changed his mind on any of this. And so there's questions inside the administration on whether or not this meeting is going to really move the needle significantly enough to ultimately get to that ceasefire deal, which, of course, Donald Trump has wanted since he was running on the campaign trail last year.
Ben, I'm wondering what your expectations are from this summit, because I know, you know, the president seems to think that he can get in the room and convince Putin to go his way. I'm sure Putin thinks exactly the opposite, which is why, you know, the president has this kind of object permanence issue where he tends to go with sometimes the last person to speak to him. Who of these two do you think is going to win out in a room? And do you think Russia is counting on being able to sway the president, who was for a moment, it looks like, possibly turning away from Putin, to get him back in the fold?
Yeah, look, nothing is going to change Vladimir Putin's views. Nothing has changed his views on Ukraine over the last decade. Even after the full-scale invasion, the sanctions, unprecedented sanctions put on Russia by the Biden administration, didn't change his view. The tens and tens of thousands of Russians who've died on the front lines have not changed his view. So I have no idea why Donald Trump thinks, you know, him being in a room with Vladimir Putin is somehow going to change Putin's position. Putin's position has been absolutely the same since the first day of the Trump administration, since all of this diplomacy, all of these promises to end the war started. It's that I get to keep all of the parts of Ukraine that Russia currently occupies, that Russia has illegally annexed. Ukraine is never going to be allowed inside of NATO, and Ukraine doesn't really get credible security guarantees. So at some point in the future, I might be able to invade again and take some more territory. That's Putin's position. It's very clear, very consistent on it. And I just see no strategy from the Trump administration to move Putin. And so the question is not whether Putin moves, it's whether Trump essentially capitulates to Putin's view of the conflict, calls it some kind of peace deal, and tries to impose a version of it on Zelensky and the Europeans, who absolutely do not want to see the legitimacy of Russia taking that territory. They're realistic that Ukraine's military capacity to take all that back is limited, but the point is that that should not be the price of a ceasefire, giving all that land away, recognizing Russian control of that land, and getting ahead of Ukraine's own choices about whether they can join the European Union or whether they can join NATO. So that's really what this is about. It's Trump wanting, the kind of short-term sugar high news cycle victory of saying he's, achieving some kind of peace, and Putin wanting to essentially win the war on his terms. And that's why it's such a kind of uncertain situation, because the White House, they can move expectations up and down. What they can't do is describe how they're going to move Vladimir Putin.
Garrett, you heard Ben mention strategy. I'm wondering if it seems like the White House and Moscow both have very different strategies, whereas Trump is much more looking at the immediate, at the right now, at what it's doing, to his campaign promises, where Putin has had this job for a long time. And Russian leaders tend to think in decades and centuries rather than election cycles. What has the White House said about, is there any kind of long-term strategy after this meeting, or are they just taking the meeting and then seeing from there?
Yeah, it's almost entirely reactive, Christina. You just heard from the president. The goal of this meeting, it seems, is now to create a second meeting, to get Zelensky and Putin in a room together, something that Putin doesn't want. You have to remember that the president ran on a campaign pledge of ending this war on or before day one back in office. We're at day 200 and something. So the plan, as much as it existed during his campaign, has clearly gone out the window. Whether there's anything else, that can be brought to the table to sort of change the calculus on this, I think, is the other question. What the president does have in his back pocket, if you will, is a sanctions bill authored by Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal on Capitol Hill that has something like 85 co-sponsors that could come down quite hard, not on Russia specifically or directly, but on Russia's trading partners. That, coupled with the president's favorite economic tool, tariffs, in this case, again, secondary tariffs on Russia's economic partners, is kind of the one major economic weapon that he could have to shape the broader geopolitical battlefield, if you will, here to try to create more pressure on Russia. But the president has seemed pretty, if not opposed, not exactly rushing to apply those tools, at least in advance of these meetings. So, again, we're in very much a wait-and-see posture here.
Yeah, Shelby, and that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about, because you've heard Trump say there's going to be severe consequences. Those are potentially those secondary sanctions Garrett just mentioned. Basically, the biggest consumers of Russian oil, which props up the Russian economy, are China and India. But have you really heard any kind of desire from the White House, from White House officials, to pull that trigger, given that the Trump administration might need China or India for other foreign policy goals and might not want to, make them go to the mat on this when they need them for something else?
Well, we're certainly not going to see anything before this Friday meeting, but even after the meeting, we've asked the president about this very topic. I asked him last week about the possibility of sanctioning China, who is a big importer of Russian oil, and he sort of didn't answer. He said, wait and see, essentially. And so I think that goes to show that there are other factors when they're looking at some of these secondary sanctions that might not ultimately benefit the U.S. And so there is a reluctance about how far they want to go. And I think that's something that Russia recognizes, not to mention the fact that we have heard the president sort of move towards the posture of being a little bit stricter on Russia over the past several weeks and over the last month. But at the same time, he still seems reluctant to actually pull that trigger and move ahead with some of those sanctions. And that's something that certainly Russia is well aware of.
And I do want to acknowledge the irony here with the location, and that is the U.S. actually acquired Alaska from Russia when the then Tsar needed money to fund his war in, wait for it, Crimea. But that aside, Ben, before we go, I do want to ask you, if you are Zelensky, if you are a member of the EU, if you are a European prime minister and you are watching this go down, what do you do? How do you address this? How do you take back the narrative from Trump, or do you just have to wait and see?
They're in wait and see mode. And look, it's connected to the consequences here, because the reality is tariffs, secondary sanctions, those would hurt the countries we'd impose them on. They'd also hurt us. It hurt the United States to suddenly throw huge tariffs on China and India and sanction them and disrupt the global economy even further than Trump already has. What would help in applying pressure on Putin is significant additional weapons to the Ukrainians, which have essentially been not entirely turned off, but definitely slowed down. Now, what Zelensky and the Europeans have chosen to do since that Oval Office meeting in which Trump and Vance humiliated Zelensky is they've chosen to kind of let this string play out. The Ukrainians agreed to a 30-day ceasefire. Putin did not. The Ukrainians have tried to show that they're the reasonable ones. And I think what they want to see is, will Trump get in the room and see that Putin is as inflexible as they know he is, right? Zelensky knows that Putin is inflexible. If Trump sees that, they'll try to persuade Trump, look, it's not just sanctions, it's unfreezing Russian assets and that maybe providing them to the Ukrainians. It's providing another weapons package to the Ukrainians. It's coming closer to the European and Ukrainian view. If Trump comes out of this meeting and he seems like he's trending in Putin's direction, that he wants to impose some solution on Zelensky where he has to formally cede territory, then they'll have a choice to make. They can't be in this middle ground anymore where they're trying to hug Trump, even though they don't agree with him. There's a breaking point coming that they'll have to decide whether or not they're going to stand up to Trump or whether they're not. And I think that's going to be the real question coming out of this meeting is if Trump takes Putin's side, do the Europeans and the Ukrainians accept that? Or do they stand up for themselves against that?
All right, it's going to be a very interesting day tomorrow. Garrett Haake, Shelby Talcott, and Ben Rhodes, thank you all so much.